Edifice of Trust podcast. The Edifice of Trust podcast is a thoughtful discussion of today's current events from the perspective of America's founding principles. Welcome from heart-pumping music to head-thumping commentary. Today we'll be discussing how to free our captive public schools. It seemed like a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate, that just when I began to prepare this presentation on how the teachers' unions have captured public education, that Arne Duncan published his new book, How Schools Work. If anybody knows how schools actually work, it is likely to be Arne Duncan. He was Secretary of Education for President Obama after serving as superintendent of Chicago schools for 8 years. One would think that the purpose of public education is to educate American children and prepare them for life in a very competitive adult world. America needs productive, educated citizens so that it can function as the founders intended. But despite spending more per student than any other country, the academic achievement of our students is only mediocre. The Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, rankings for 2015 place U.S. in 30th place out of 35 OECD countries in math, and only slightly better in science at 19th. How is America going to be in the forefront of developing artificial intelligence or be the discoverer of the next medical breakthroughs with these mediocre achievement results? No, the purpose of our schools is not the academic development of our children, but, apparently, to provide for the financial security of teachers' unions members. Mr. Duncan confirms this in his book. You can tell he's on the right track because he's been criticized by both the right and the left. He first encountered this problem when he was in college and tutoring a high school student for his ACT exam. Despite having a B average, the student could only read at a second grade level. Nevertheless, he had been promoted every year and was now preparing to graduate. How was this young man going to cope with modern society, let alone get in and graduate from college, if he could only read at the second grade level? In the private sector, if you produce an inferior product, you will go out of business. If there is a better, cheaper alternative, people will buy that product and not the shoddy, expensive one. But things are different in the public sector. The public sector strives to achieve, quote, higher goals than the mere financial profits that are lusted after by the private sector. But in doing so, they eliminate the invisible hand, as described by Adam Smith, that guides private sector transactions and makes the free market economy so effective. Education in America has historically and traditionally been a local affair. There was no nationwide government in the colonies and few resources available to fund colony or statewide school systems. Local communities were often required to fund local schools for basic literacy. The churches taught their parishioners so they could read the Bible. The early American education system was a hodgepodge of homeschooling, church and parochial schools, private schools, and public schools. Despite the lack of centralized education in the United States, or perhaps because of it, by the 19th century, America had the most literate population in the world, a pivotal factor in ascendancy as a world power. But as government began funding more and more public schools, teachers began to organize into unions. The National Education Association, the NEA, was founded in 1857, and the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, in 1916. American education continued to be the envy of the world well into the 20th century, but has fallen into third world status as we enter the 21st. All of the blame cannot be placed on the teachers' unions, but a lot can. The union's progressive agenda has allowed our middle schools and high schools to descend into chaos, as identity politics and moral equivalency replace learning. Mary Meeker, a partner at venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins, points out that while U.S. students' rankings against students in other OECD countries has fallen, their self-confidence has risen. This disconnect between feeling good about yourself and your actual performance is the result of the progressive agenda foisted upon our students by the teachers' unions. Teachers' unions use members' dues to fund political activities and support political candidates. They are one of the largest contributors to political campaigns in the country, and about 95% of their campaign contributions goes to the Democrats, according to the New York Times. The teacher's job to instruct our children is a valued service in the public interest. But the purpose of the teachers' unions is to represent the private interests of the teachers. Teachers deserve decent wages and working conditions, just like any other worker. But striking for higher pay and gold-plated pensions are not in the public interest. The teachers' union tried to convince the public that the teachers' interests are one and the same as the public interest. But this is clearly not the case. Teachers' unions are constantly trying to reduce class size, asserting that smaller classes are better. But better in what way? Singapore, which ranks at the top of the PISA rankings, has class sizes 33% larger than those in the U.S. And China, which whips us in math and science, has even larger classes. Whether small class sizes are better for students is debatable, but they are clearly better for teachers and especially for teachers' unions. Small class size is a principal reason that the U.S. spends more per student than almost every other country. Competition is what drives our free market economy that has provided us with so much prosperity. But the teachers' unions want a monopoly on education and lobby their progressive Democratic representatives to block school choice, such as charter schools, by asserting that our taxes for education should only go to public schools. But as noted earlier in my presentation on Building Blocks Part 3, monopoly is one of the forms of capture of the public interest by private interests. Further, it is our tax money that pays teacher salaries that go to union dues that work against our public interest. The Supreme Court recently ruled that government workers could not be compelled to pay for union dues, even though workers benefit from the collective bargaining efforts of the union. The ruling overturned the 1977 decision of the Supreme Court, Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, that separated the union's collective bargaining activities from its political activities. But I think the court missed the point. It is not the workers' dues that should not be used for this union activity. It is the taxes we pay as taxpayers that fund these union activities that work against the public interest. The only resolution to this conflict between the public and the private interest is to break the monopoly of the public schools and with it the capture of public education by left-wing teachers' unions whose progressive views do not reflect those of the taxpayers that fund them. Parents should be given vouchers so that they can make the best educational choices for their children. Once we have done that, we can return our focus to actually educating our children. Now stay tuned for a brief message. Don't forget, my latest book, 2017, A Trumpian Year in Review, is now available in paperback and ebook versions on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iBooks. Also available are my previous publications, Principled Policy and Edifice of Trust. And if you want some adventure, try my novel, Tawantinsuyu. More information on these books, plus links to retail outlets, is available on my website, www.edificeoftrust.com. Thank you. Welcome back. If an enemy wanted to undermine America and make it weak and vulnerable, Nothing would be more effective than keeping our next generation ignorant and dependent on government for their basic necessities. The progressive left, that shudders at America's superpower status, views American history as fraught with slavery, racism, and imperialism, and believes our American citizens to be incompetent boobs that need the heavy hand of government to direct their lives, is creating a citizenry that fulfills that vision by educating our children to praise mediocrity and feel good about it, fit only to be drones dependent on the welfare state. Our enemies lack the ability to undermine our educational system, but with the help of the teachers' unions, they don't have to. Thank you. Thanks for listening to my podcast. If you would like to hear more Edifice of Trust podcasts, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.